My ribbing is complete, and before we proceed, there are a couple little tips that I would like to share with you. First, this is my initial yarn tail. I consider it my friend because it marks the rows for me. I always know that I'm ready to start a new row when I've knitted all the way around the circle and I'm back here. So I leave that till the very end, and at that point we'll weave it in up this column of stitches. But I do suggest leaving it because it's just the most easy automatic row marker that you could ever have. Second, I decided not to knit quite as many rows as I initially planned to. And you can see why. I'm trying to get where, there you go. You can see how much I have. I'm knitting a teeny weeny sweater, and I don't want the ribbing to be disproportionate to the sweater. And this came out a little longer per row than I expected. And that's one of the nice things about a design like this, that's okay. We can adjust as we go. So I expected to knit 12 rows. I kind of rethought it, realizing that that is for the smallest sweater in the pattern, but I'm going 2 sizes smaller. And I actually ended up with 9, looking like plenty to me. I want to suggest that you never go smaller than 1 inch of length in your ribbing. The reason being that if you do, the ribbing tends to flip out and not do the job that we had in mind for it at all. So do 1 inch or better, which is why I suggested 2 for most baby sizes. But for this teeny weeny size, I'm going to go slightly less than 2. Now it's time to move on to the stockinette knitting that will be here. We have knitted up to this point, and it's time to knit from the top of the hem to the bottom of the underarm, still knitting in the round. In my pattern, I give you a number of inches to knit because I know it will be pretty easy for you to get your knitting and measure down there and get an accurate measurement. In some patterns that you might be working with, you will only have a desired row count, and if you are not getting the identical row gauge, you may want to adjust it. So here's how. Let's say your pattern is written as this one is, with 4 stitches, 6 rows per inch as the stated gauge, and you are told to knit 30 rows. How do we know how long that was intended to be? Divide it by 6. 6 times 5 is 30. There's your result. That means this dimension is 5 inches. That's above the ribbing and up to the underarm. So let's start. This is the easy part of the project. We just continue round and round and round, knitting stockinette, the good old Kiss U wrap that makes such lovely stitches. Here is how I tend to do it, but this is a personal preference. I wrap the whole side, including the last stitch, and knit the last stitch first. That way I don't have to keep holding on to everything. Then I knit over to that stitch, and then I wrap the next side around, adjusting as I go around that corner. The final stitch, the one that I knitted over to lock everything down, may tend to grow a little bit. So with practice, you can feel the correct tension with your fingers to give the yarn as you resume knitting around the corner. It's usually not a big tug that's needed at all. You don't want a tight spot either, but you don't want a loose spot at the corner. And if your loom is perfectly lined up, you wouldn't get one except for that fact of having paused at the corner, which can let the final stitch loosen up. Now, for your first few sweaters, you should do exactly what I'm doing. Just knit around and around, but there's nothing to stop you from changing colors from time to time so as to make stripes. After your first few sweaters, you may want to do something to raise the interest level. You could put a cable down the front using the same pattern. You could work a little bit of intarsia into the front of the sweater, like a heart or a sailboat or a duck, a daisy. Intarsia shapes have to be pretty simple, but you get a lot of bang for your buck doing it. You can work a stitch pattern made of knits and purls, such as basket weave. And for basket weave, I refer you to the recent scarf knit along. There's a good demo of that in that series. So for this sweater, I'm knitting the tiny size. I'm going to knit 4 inches of length and then stop at the underarm. And when I stop and you stop, we're going to remeasure our gauge for row gauge. From the underarm down, it is not a crisis if the sweater's not the exact length we had in mind. You've got a little leeway about what works well there. From the underarm to the shoulder, it is terrifically important because the sleeve won't fit properly if we don't get the top of the sleeve the same size as the armhole. And the sweater won't fit anybody properly if the armhole is not a reasonable size for the person. So row gauge becomes much more important than it starts out on this style of sweater. The happy news, though, is that by the time we've got the whole torso knitted, we have a very nice, much bigger than a swatch piece of knitting to confirm the true row gauge and make certain that we are knitting the armholes to match the sleeves. I'll see you when I get there. Happy knitting.